I'm going to start by using the socket function. So let's start by searching socket in the man pages. You can see I first need to include this file, so I'll just add this include here. And I can start using the function. So I'm gonna call socket. And the first argument is domain. So let's see what domain accepts. We can see that domain actually has a couple of different options. I'm just gonna use AF_INET for regular IPv4. Afterwards, second argument is gonna be the type. You need to actually choose the type of the socket. I'm just gonna use sock stream, which will be a simple TCP socket. That's a socket that HTTP protocol actually uses. Finally, the last argument is called protocol. You can just leave it at 0 to make it default. This function will return the file descriptor of the socket, so I'm just going to save this in a variable called s. Afterwards, we're going to use the bind function to actually bind the socket to a certain address. So I'm going to open the man page for bind. You can see that this also has the same include file, so no need to add any includes. I'm going to start by passing the arguments. So bind gets the socket file descriptor. That's just going to be s. Afterwards, it gets a structure with the address to bind. I'm going to define this later. I'm going to just pass the pointer of the structure, so add an ampersand over here. And I'm going to pass the size of the structure as well, which is just going to be size of address. Let's define the structure for a sec. So that's going to be struct, and then sock adder in. That's going to be for internet. Let's open the man page for sock adder in for a sec. You can see we have a couple of types here. Reason I'm using sock adder in is that's the one that is suitable for IPv4. And you have 3 items that you need to fill in here. First one is the family, so that's going to be just AF_INET. So I'm just going to go back here. Let's give it a name for this structure. I'm going to start filling the details. AF_INET for the first one. Second one is going to be the port number. Now this is kind of tricky. I'm going to open Python. Now the port I want to use for my web server is the port 8080, but this is kind of tricky because you need to change the order of the bytes. So I'm just going to see what 8080 is in hex. So I'm using the hex function from Python. You can see that this is how it looks like in hex. What you need to pass to the actual structure is this number but opposite in hex. So I'm just going to pass 90 and then 1F. This is actually opposite order, and this is how the port number and the IP address are accepted by the socket API. In the case of the address, I'll just leave this as 0, in which case it'll just bind on all my network interfaces. That's fine with me. After bind, let's call the listen function. Listen will actually initialize this socket for incoming connections. So after bind, I'm going to call listen. And I'm going to again pass the socket, and I'm going to pass an argument called backlog. This is just the number of connections that can be waiting at the same time until the server starts rejecting new connections. I'm just going to put this as 10. Doesn't really matter because we're just doing this as a POC. This is not for production. Finally, I can call the accept function. Accept will actually accept the connection coming from the clients. So I'm going to call accept and pass in the socket. And then we have 2 additional arguments, address and address length. Both can be actually 0. If you want to get some additional client information, you want to pass something here, but in our case, we're just going to leave both of them as 0. That's fine. This will actually return the file descriptor of the client socket. So I'm just going to save this in client FD. Now I can actually receive the string that the client is sending. So I'm going to call recv. I'm going to pass in client FD. Let's open the documentation for recv for a sec. Afterwards, it gets a buffer. I'm just going to call this buffer. And the length, let's just keep this as 256. Keep it as simple as possible. Flags can just be 0. I'm going to put the buffer here as well. So buffer will be 256 bytes. Let's just fill it with zeros. This will actually get the HTTP request, and the HTTP request looks something like this. We're just going to keep this only supporting GET requests, so it's going to look something like this, GET, and then you'll have some kind of file here, file.html. Then you'll have a bunch of additional stuff. We're actually only interested in extracting this, So I'm going to skip 5 characters from the beginning to get to the file here, and I'm going to go ahead and for the first white space, I'm just going to change this to 0 to make it a null terminator. So I'll have a string only containing the file, so I can just open this file. So I'll just put this in a comment for a sec. And let's do this. So I'm going to save aside another char pointer. This will actually be the file. Just call it f. I'm going to start by going to the buffer and skipping 5 bytes. This will get me here. And afterwards, I'm going to use a function called strchar. So let's search for this function for a sec. strchar. This function actually locates a character in a string, so we'll just return a pointer to where the character was found. You can see that we need to include string.h for this, so I'm going to go to the top of the file and include this. Now let's go ahead and call this strchar. I'm going to pass in the string, and I want to search for a space. Now I want to take the result of this and assign it to 0. So this will just change the space to a null terminator, which will just change this to a null terminator, leave me only with the file. Afterwards, I'm going to use the open function to open the file. So I'm going to read the documentation of open. You can see this comes from fcntl.h, so I'm going to add this include. And I'm going to call this, and I'm going to pass in the file that I want to open, the path. And flags can just be, in this case, the argument of flags must include one of the following access modes. I'm just going to use this read-only mode, so I'm going to pass into this o read only. This will return the open file, so I'm going to call this opened file descriptor. Afterwards, I'm going to use a system call called sendFile. This enables me to actually transfer data between file descriptors. So I'm going to use this to transfer data from the open file, which I opened over here. This is the actual file on the file system that the client is requesting. And I'm going to send this to the client socket, which we have over here. This is the client FD. So I'm going to call sendFile, which comes, by the way, from another include file, so I'm going to include this as well, sendfile.h. Let's see the arguments here. So it starts with the output file descriptor, which will be the socket, so the client FD. Afterwards, the input, which will be the open file from the file system. Then we have an offset, which can just be 0, and count, which will be 256. We're just going to keep this simple on the 256 bytes. Finally, we can close the file descriptors, so I'm going to close the opened file and close the socket as well. Close the client socket as well. Also, let's see the include file of close. That comes from unistd. Finally, another thing that I missed is the include file of this structure. And I scroll down to the part where you can see this defined here. You can see that it actually comes from this include file, so I'm going to include this here. That should be it. Let's go ahead and try to compile this. We have a little error over here. Open FD. Yeah, we need to actually add a type over here. Let's try now. Looks like it compiles successfully. Let's go ahead and run the server, and I'm going to run this with strace so I can actually see what's going on. Okay, see that the bind actually succeeded, so it returned 0. And now it's accepting a new connection, so now it's waiting for a connection. Let's go ahead and just open a small HTML file. So I'll just call this index.html. I'm gonna write here hello from server. It works. I'm gonna close this, and let's open another terminal. I'm gonna go to a different directory. You can see that it's empty right now. I'm gonna use wget. I'm gonna pass in the port of the server. I'm gonna say that I wanna grab index.html. You can see that it's successfully grabbed and the server exited. And if we go ahead and cat this file, you can see that we see the message from the server right over here. This is the file sent from the server to the client. Subscribe for more programming videos, and thanks for watching.